The first shell fell at dawn. It came shrieking from the eastern hills like some monstrous bird of iron, tearing through the stillness of the morning and bursting into a savage bloom of fire and earth. The explosion rattled the very marrow of the men hunched in the trench, a violent reminder that peace had no place here. Private William Carter flinched instinctively, his fingers digging into the mud-caked trench wall until his nails bent back painfully. The soil was wet from last night's rain, cold, and heavy with the smell of rot. Around him, the other men reacted in their own ways. One spat curses under his breath. Another clutched a cross around his neck, lips moving rapidly in prayer. A few simply stared ahead, eyes glassy and empty, as though their souls had already fled the battlefield, leaving only bodies behind to endure what was to come. The war had stretched on for 18 relentless months. Once, dawn had meant sunrise, the promise of a new day filled with ordinary tasks, breakfast with his sister Emily, chores in his father's garden, the laughter of village children on their way to school. Now, dawn meant shells. Dawn meant blood. Dawn meant survival, nothing more. William lifted his rifle, more out of habit than readiness, and ran a rag across its barrel. The grime clung stubbornly, mixing with the damp, as though even the weapon was weary of this endless slaughter. His hands trembled as he worked, but not from fear. Fear had been burned out of him long ago, consumed by the unbroken fire of battle. What replaced it was worse, a gnawing exhaustion that hollowed him out day by day, bone by bone. He was 22 years old, yet he carried himself like an old man. The cracked mirror he kept in his pack, a souvenir from before the front, showed him a stranger, sunken eyes, hollow cheeks, a face carved by sleepless nights and too many ghosts. Positions. Keep your heads low. The sergeant's voice cut sharply through the chaos. William obeyed without hesitation, pressing himself deeper into the mud as another shell whistled overhead. A heartbeat later it struck, closer this time. The trench shook as if the earth itself were in pain. Chunks of soil cascaded down, filling helmets, boots, even mouths. The taste of dirt was bitter on his tongue, but he swallowed it without complaint. Complaints had no place here. To his right, a soldier screamed. William clenched his jaw and forced his gaze forward, refusing to look. He had learned the hard way that looking was dangerous. To see every broken face, every body twisted unnaturally in the mud, was to invite despair. And despair, in this place, was more fatal than any bullet. He knew the scream would fade soon, replaced by silence, the same silence that swallowed so many before. He gripped his rifle tighter, knuckles whitening, as if the cold steel could anchor him against the tide of death threatening to pull him under. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid stench of cordite. Somewhere above, the sky brightened with the faintest blush of sunrise, but it was lost beneath the haze of battle. William wondered briefly, absurdly, if the sun even dared to shine on a world so broken. Around him, the trench groaned with the restless shuffling of men waiting for the next shell, the next order, the next inevitable loss. Each heartbeat was measured in explosions. Each breath was stolen from fate. William pressed his forehead briefly against the trench wall, closing his eyes. For a moment, just a heartbeat, he let himself imagine he was far away. He saw Emily in the garden, her laughter carrying on the wind as she swung beneath the old oak tree. He smelled summer rain on warm soil, heard the sound of church bells across the valley. Then another shell landed, shattering the vision. The earth shook. Someone shouted for a medic. The war dragged him back, as it always did, as it always would, until nothing remained but mud, steel, and silence. In his breast pocket lay a letter from his sister, Emily. It was folded neatly, the edges soft from being handled too many times, and the paper had absorbed the faint smell of mud and smoke. It was the only letter that had reached him in weeks. Emily wrote every Sunday, he knew that, but most were swallowed by the endless machinery of war, censors, misplaced sacks, or simply the chaos of men dying faster than the post could keep up. Yet somehow this one had slipped through, perhaps by luck, perhaps by providence. Will, The garden is blooming again. Father finally repaired the old swing, though it creaks louder than before. Do you remember how you used to push me so high I thought I could touch the sky? Come home soon. I saved you a seat under the oak tree. Her words were simple, but in the trenches they felt like scripture. William Carter reread the letter whenever the bombardments paused, whenever the guns hesitated just long enough for silence to creep back in. He would unfold the paper carefully, as though it were made of glass, and trace the ink with calloused fingers. The handwriting was unmistakably Emily's, neat, flowing, but with little quirks where she pressed too hard. Those small imperfections made the letter real, alive, and they pulled him out of the mud-stained nightmare and back to the small village he had left behind. The letter was a tether, fragile yet unbreakable. It connected him to a world that still smelled of fresh bread, where church bells rang on Sundays, and where children chased one another through fields instead of dodging bullets. It reminded him that somewhere beyond this endless war, the seasons still turned, flowers still bloomed, and life continued. But every time he folded it away, guilt clawed at him. Emily imagined him safe, smiling, whole. She wrote of oak trees and swings as though her brother were still the boy who used to laugh with her, who used to climb onto the roof just to watch the stars. She didn't know that William had changed, not in the small ways time changes a man, but in the brutal, merciless way war does. She didn't know he had seen men torn apart in the mud, bodies flung like rag dolls by shells. She didn't know he had carried wounded comrades only to feel their blood cooling on his hands minutes later. She didn't know that he had killed strangers who looked no older than boys, who screamed for their mothers in languages he couldn't understand. How could she? The army never let such truths reach home. Letters were censored, words blackened by ink if they came too close to honesty. Men were expected to write of bravery, of honor, of steadfast courage, not of fear, not of the smell of rotting flesh, not of the nightmares that came even when one managed to sleep. So William wrote back carefully, choosing words that would reassure. He told her about the weather, about the food, about how the men kept one another's spirits high. He never told her that the food was stale bread and thin stew, that the weather was mud that swallowed boots whole, that spirits high meant singing songs to drown out the sobbing of boys who wouldn't live to see another morning. And when he folded his reply, sealing the lie inside the envelope, his chest ached. Still, he couldn't stop rereading her letter. Each time, he lingered on the part about the oak tree. He saw it in his mind, towering over their garden, its branches swaying in the summer breeze. He remembered the way Emily's hair had flown about as he pushed her on the swing, her laughter ringing louder than the creak of the old rope. He remembered sitting beneath it in the shade with a book, listening to the bees hum lazily through the flowers. The oak tree had been a constant in his life, something immovable, something eternal. Here, in the trenches, nothing was constant except death. When the shells rumbled in the distance, William would slip the letter back into his breast pocket, close to his heart. He told himself he carried it there for comfort, but deep down he knew the truth. It was also a shield. If he were to fall, the letter would be found with him, proof that he had once been loved, that there had once been a life beyond this mud. Sometimes, when the nights were too long, he wondered if Emily would recognize him if he returned. The war was carving away pieces of him, bit by bit. Would she see her brother in the man who stumbled home? Or would she look into his eyes and find only shadows? He hoped the letter would remind him of who he was, of who he had been. He hoped it would tether him tightly enough that, when the war finally released its grip, he could still find his way back to that oak tree and the swing that creaked louder than before. And until then, in the brief silences between bombardments, he would keep unfolding Emily's words, whispering them to himself like a prayer, clinging to them as though they were the last thread keeping him from slipping completely into the abyss. Beside William crouched Tom Whitaker, a farmer's son from the rolling fields of Yorkshire. Tom was stocky, broad-shouldered from years of lifting hay bales and pushing plows before the war had stolen him away. Despite the mud, the cold, and the ceaseless roar of artillery, Tom carried with him something small yet precious, a string of worn wooden prayer beads. He kept them looped around his wrist, rubbing them gently whenever the firing grew heavy. Some men clung to flasks, others to photographs, but for Tom it was always those beads, polished smooth now, not by craftsmanship, but by the constant touch of anxious fingers. Unlike many of the soldiers, Tom had a gift for finding humor in misery. Where others collapsed beneath the weight of despair, he somehow managed to drag a smile into even the darkest of hours. "Will," Tom whispered as another shell whistled overhead, its shriek clawing through the night sky, "if I survive this bloody war, I'm never touching porridge again. Not a spoonful. That's all the army feeds us, porridge in the morning, porridge at night, porridge so thick it could patch the holes in this trench. I swear I dream of it attacking me in my sleep, spoon in hand, marching like a sergeant." For the first time in hours, William almost laughed. His lips twitched, the absurdity enough to break the suffocating silence that pressed on them like a heavy blanket. Laughter was rare in the trenches, rarer still in moments like this. But Tom had a way of drawing it out, as if his humor were a match struck against the darkness. Their friendship was the kind that only war could forge, fast, fierce, and unbreakable. They had shared more than just rations and blankets. They had shared nights without sleep, crouching side by side as machine guns tore the air above them. They had shared whispered prayers when the bombardments grew unbearable. And they had shared silence, not the comfortable kind of silence two friends might share by a fireside, but the heavy, suffocating silence that followed after watching a boy no older than themselves bleed into the mud, his cries fading into nothing. Tom had told William about his village, the gentle green of the fields and the song of larks that rose with the morning sun. He spoke often of his mother's voice, soft and lilting, singing hymns as she worked. But most of all, he spoke of a girl named Margaret, a baker's daughter with hair the color of ripe wheat. He wanted to marry her, he said, once the war was over. His eyes always softened when he spoke her name, as though he could see her even here, in the choking smoke of the trenches. In return, William told Tom about Emily, his younger sister, and the oak tree in their garden. He described how they used to swing from the old rope until their arms ached, how Emily's laughter would ring out so loud that the neighbors down the lane would scold them for disturbing the peace. He told Tom about the way the summer rain smelled on hot earth, how it would patter on the roof while he and Emily pressed their noses to the window, watching droplets race down the glass. Together, they clung to these fragments of normalcy, tiny pieces of a life that seemed impossibly far away. They painted pictures of it in their minds, weaving dreams to shield themselves from the nightmares that surrounded them. When shells fell and the ground trembled, they spoke of harvests and Sunday dinners. When comrades were carried away lifeless, they spoke of weddings and children not yet born. War had taken everything from them, their innocence, their freedom, their certainty of tomorrow. But in their friendship, they found something it could not destroy. And so, crouched in the mud with the enemy's guns just 100 yards away, William and Tom held on to each other's words like lifelines. Not because they believed in victory, nor even in survival, but because, for as long as they could still laugh about porridge, still dream about oak trees and Margaret's smile, they were not yet entirely lost to the darkness. By noon, the order came, an advance across no man's land. The men froze. Everyone knew what it meant. The land between trenches was a graveyard of broken helmets, shattered rifles, and unburied bones. Machine guns watched it like hawks. Advancing, there was less an order, more a sentence. Captain Arthur Mason strode along the line, his face grim. "We move at dusk. Remember, we fight not just for ourselves, but for the ones back home." William's throat tightened. For Emily. For her letters. When dusk fell, flares streaked the sky, painting the battlefield in a ghostly glow. William climbed out of the trench, Tom at his side. The ground squelched beneath their boots, sucking at them like quicksand. They moved in crouched runs, hearts hammering, as bullets sliced the air. Screams rose and fell like waves. Men stumbled, fell, and did not rise again. William forced himself forward, his rifle heavy in his hands. Then Tom fell. A bullet caught him in the chest. His prayer beads scattered into the mud, glistening like spilled tears. Tom, William dropped beside him, pressing his hands to the wound. The blood was hot, soaking through his fingers. Tom's lips moved, forming words lost in the thunder of artillery. Only one reached William's ears. Home. And then he was still. William stared at his friend's lifeless eyes, a void opening inside him. But the machine guns didn't care. The war didn't care. A hand yanked him up, and he stumbled forward with the others, Tom's body vanishing in the mire behind him. Hours later, when the firing lulled, William found himself trapped in a shell crater. His unit had scattered, and the night was thick with smoke. He gripped his rifle, every muscle tense. A rustle came from the other side of the crater. He swung his weapon up and froze. A boy crouched there. An enemy soldier. He couldn't have been older than 16. His helmet was too big, slipping over his eyes. His hands shook as he raised a pistol, the barrel wavering like a leaf in the wind. For a long moment, they stared at each other. Two boys in different uniforms, both terrified, both unwilling killers. The boy's lips trembled. William thought of Emily, of Tom, of all the faces blurred by smoke and mud. Slowly, he lowered his rifle. The boy blinked, then, after a hesitation, lowered his pistol too. Neither spoke. The silence between them was louder than any bombardment. When the night deepened, the boy crawled away, vanishing into the dark. William never knew his name, but the memory of his eyes, wide, fearful, human, stayed. Months later, the war ended. Not with a victory, but with exhaustion. The guns fell silent, and men stumbled out of trenches like ghosts, unsure whether to cheer or weep. William returned home. The village looked unchanged, but he had changed too much to recognize it fully. Emily ran to him, her laughter breaking into sobs as she clung to him. The oak tree still stood, its branches heavy with leaves. At night, however, the echoes came. He saw Tom's beads scattered in the mud, heard the boy's trembling breath in the crater. He woke drenched in sweat, the silence of the battlefield pressing on him. Yet, each morning, he sat under the oak tree with Emily, listening to the creak of the old swing. Slowly, painfully, he learned to breathe again. He never spoke much of the war. Some memories were too heavy for words. But when the wind rustled through the leaves, it sounded like whispers of Tom, of the nameless boy, of all the voices lost. And William listened, carrying them within him, so they would not be forgotten.